welcome back to the Healing for the Heart podcast, People Just Like Us. And today is a really special podcast, so it's our Christmas podcast. Can you believe, I know we feel we should have sleigh bells ringing in the background or something, shouldn't we?
Yeah, that would be fun.
Maybe when Bassett does the editing on it, he'll put sleigh bells over the top
that
of
would make it look great.
We can't quite believe that we are now a year since we started these podcasts. So it was the first one was Christmas last year.
Yeah, it was.
That was the very first one that we did, and then we've been doing them all year. We've just been chatting about the reach of our podcasts, and we seem to be a hit in Korea. Yeah,
We'll take it. Got to be a hit somewhere.
Absolutely. Why don't you, if you're watching this or if you're listening to it, why don't you let us know where you're from and where you're listening to this from, because it'd be really exciting to see. So if you're following us on social media and you see it, put it in the comments and tell us where you're listening or watching from. That would be fascinating, I think, to see.
Yeah, so it really would.
Christmas 2022 is approaching. A year since the last Christmas. We were just laughing a minute ago. We're on our third Prime Minister since the last Christmas,
we are.
Clearly.
Yeah.
Hopefully, by the time we get to Christmas this year, we'll not have had a fourth one.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be still on the third one. Yep.
Absolutely. And obviously, you know, things have shifted a bit, because last year we were talking about the fact that COVID was still around in terms of restrictions. Obviously, COVID's still around. But COVID was still around in terms of restrictions, and it certainly looks like this year we're going to be restriction free over Christmas.
Yeah, which seems a bit mad. I don't know about you, but it feels I can't do the timings in my head. I was talking to someone the other day, and they'd said something about wearing masks, and I said, oh, we only, that was only removed as a requirement in about April time. And they looked at me and said, no, it wasn't. And I said, yeah, it was. It feels like time's a really, really funny thing. And then here we are, and there's been so many other pretty rubbish things that have happened this year, and it feels difficult coming up to Christmas this year in a whole different way, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've talked over the piece in the last year about the whole idea of the reality of the COVID pandemic being a collective trauma for people that they were coming out of. And I suppose for us, we were thinking, because we know from the research that it's not during the trauma that people need the support, but afterwards. So we were kind of thinking, so after the pandemic, we're going to get a real glut of people who are looking for support. And although we did have an increase, it wasn't the glut of people. And then it dawned on us that we had gone straight from the collective trauma of the pandemic into the collective trauma of there being a war just on our doorstep, effectively in Europe. And now we've hurtled into the cost of living crisis as well.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like folks haven't had time to come up for air from the pandemic, but we've hit yet another crisis.
Yeah, and it feels pretty grim, I think, in terms of switching on the news and it just feels quite hopeless, I think. And if I think about it too much, then I start to feel just not very happy and just quite anxious about things. So I'm having to be really careful about how much news I take in, because there's only so much that I can do, and I can do what I can do in my patch of the world, but actually I also need to keep myself okay.
Yeah. It's even looking towards Christmas as well. I mean, it's like, this is a Christmas podcast, so I suppose we don't want to be all doom and gloom on a Christmas podcast. But even looking towards Christmas, I was thinking about getting the decorations out and thinking, it doesn't seem that long since I put the decorations away. And why am I getting the decorations out again? But actually, we're nearly in December.
Yeah.
Obviously, this will go out once we hit December, but we're recording this and we're not quite at the end of November yet, but actually it's nearly there.
Yeah.
How on earth does that happen?
I know. I was just in a popular supermarket, because we're not sponsored by anybody.
And but we're ever hopeful, so if you want to sponsor us, then absolutely.
And they had real Christmas trees, and I thought, goodness me, that seems a bit early, because if you put it out now, it's going to be very dead by Christmas. That might just be me. And we don't go massively in for decorations in my house, but you go in for them quite heavily, don't you?
Well, I certainly have people living in my house that are very keen on all the decorations.
Whereas I have a very lively dog who would just be really excited to eat them all.
Yeah.
So we just don't really do it.
And I have a dog that won't come into the living room anyway because something frightened her in there, so she now lives anywhere else but there, so I can put my decorations in the living room and it's all hunky-dory. We'll be absolutely fine.
Yeah.
What What sort of stuff are we seeing though around about folks moving towards Christmas this year? Do you think, what's coming up? Television, what's coming up? Folks that are using the services here.
I think the cost of living crisis is actually really biting, and I think people are worried about how they're going to do Christmas to the level that they normally do Christmas, and it's interesting to think about why we do what we do at Christmas, and actually the way that we give. I know that I've been having conversations with people about, so how are they going to do gifts this year, and what's that going to look like, because everybody's shorter of money than they have been, and nobody knows what their next electricity bill is going to be or the next gas bill is going to be. So there's something about trying to steward well, I suppose, in terms of making sure that we can afford everything, but I always think there's a big pressure at Christmas often to kind of give to the entire world, and that's really difficult. Martin Lewis says some interesting things about that. He has like a bit of a famous thing that he did on his Christmas Save Money thing a few years ago, in which he said, Christmas actually is a time for being with the people that we love. Now that brings difficulties for some people as well, but what he then goes on to talk about is the way that giving actually is a bit of becomes a tit for tat thing, and becomes a thing of, well, I've given you this thing that cost 20 quid, so you're going to have to give me something that cost 20 quid. And actually maybe we could stop that. Maybe actually, you give to the people that are immediately around about you, but actually we don't have to give to the entire world. And what does that look like? And maybe you might want to give to charities instead. I had to get that in there. He does actually say that. But I think that's an interesting thing of, do you actually choose to do Secret Santa with people, or do you choose to go out for a nice meal with people and actually spend time rather than, trying to make everything squeeze and buy things that people are just a bit like, oh, thanks, I don't really know what I'm going to do with the 90th pair of socks that I've got.
Yeah. Yep. And I suppose, we're laughing about, you could give to charities instead, but, in actual fact, the cost of living crisis doesn't just hit individuals, and it's like, so again, obviously the timing that we're recording this, it was the Chancellor's mini statement or mid-term statement yesterday, and the national living wage going up. Now, although absolutely we would be championing the national living wage going up, the thing is that for small charities who are maybe only able to pay the living wage to people, then when that goes up, we've not had an increase in our funding in order to put that up, but we would want to be able to honour that. And so where do we find the money to do that? And I'm guessing that, for lots of people listening to this or watching this, we have an amazing amount of stuff. And I suppose, do we really need any more stuff? And do we need to put that pressure on ourselves to find more stuff for ourselves or for other people? I suppose, though, in that there's a huge amount of pressure from society and culture and the media and all the rest of it in terms of what you can have next. I can't remember a year, maybe I'm just wrong, maybe this is just a sign of age, but I can't remember a year where we had the adverts for the big stores starting as early, the Christmas adverts. We seem to have Christmas adverts been going for weeks now, and it's like, all of that stuff round about itself, no matter how good and how noble your adverts are, still puts pressure on people, because it still holds up that utopia of what Christmas should be like.
Yeah, absolutely. And that whole thing of, well, you need to make sure that you've got everything that somebody definitely wants, and you've got all the right food, and look at all this new stuff, and it feels massively pressured. I mean, we've got I have quite a number of nephews and nieces, and we enjoy giving to them, but they're getting older and it's becoming harder and harder to work out what to give them. And you ask their parents, and their parents are like, yeah, we don't know either, because actually it's just quite hard to know what would be a good gift, what would be something that would make their heart warm, that gives me the warm and fuzzies to give. And I have a real thing as well about I need to get it right. So I find the whole Christmas present thing really difficult, because I desperately don't want to get the wrong thing for people, which probably extended to the rest of my life as well, but that's a whole other podcast.
So we'll tee that one up from the new year, sure. Then, shall we? I think though that kind of pressure though can put a huge strain on people's emotional well-being too though, and people start to feel anxious or stressed or depressed, or feel like they want to check out, sometimes even start to feel angry at the fact that they can't do, or they won't do, or they choose not to do, or resisting doing what's expected or what they feel is expected from everybody else.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the weight of expectation is feels like it's huge, and sometimes I wonder where that expectation comes from, because I know that, you know, I definitely feel the weight of expectation, but I also know that most of the people around me would be saying, well, I'm not putting that expectation on you, so it's something that I suppose I'm putting on myself, but it's coming from somewhere, isn't it? That's not just something I've woken up and gone, well, let's do this. And I think, you know, I think the other thing is that we've talked a wee bit about COVID, haven't we? But the loss of COVID and the loss of all the other things that we've lost is quite big, and that can really shape that can really shape Christmas as well. I know that I know we've both had some significant losses this year, and of people that we loved, and that makes Christmas really difficult, and it changes things. It changes the way that my Christmas is going to look. I guess it changes the way that your Christmas is going to look, and that there's a grief there that actually it's really important that we acknowledge and that we recognise it's okay to feel like this. We don't actually have to just pretend that it didn't happen, because it has, and that was significant.
Yep. I think I've been thinking about that quite a lot, and I think certainly from my perspective, there's a tendency in me to want to manage the situation in order to try and not to minimise the loss or forget about the loss, but actually trying to preempt, you know, what might be there. And I think there's something about how we can just be in the midst of all of that. I think also being able to acknowledge the loss as well. There's something in that too. You know, the loss you allude to. Obviously, my closest friend died in September, and after an illness, but. You know, I remember sitting with her last year and her saying, I don't know if I'll be here next Christmas, and not doing that whole thing of, oh, of course you will be, don't be silly, but actually having that real conversation with her about, well, I don't know either, but actually facing the reality of it this year and thinking, well, what does that look like? Because we've had a pattern of things that we would do over Christmas, and now what do we do with that pattern? You know, do we continue to do that with our husband or with our family that are left? You know, do we continue to do that? Do we do something different? Because if we continue to do it, does that just highlight the loss and the fact that she's not there? You know, so there's lots of, it feels like there's lots of decisions that you have to try and make, and I think that can put you under huge amounts of pressure as well.
Yeah, and I think, you know, so my loss was my dad's wife died, so my stepmom died, and that changes many things, because that changes the way that our whole family relates to each other, actually. And so that changes the way that Christmas happens. And so suddenly you've got a whole extra managing of the situation that we've always had to do ever since my parents got divorced anyway, because it's the reality of divorce often that you have to then manage Christmas and manage those situations. Work out what it looks like. And then you bring in a loss within that, and the whole thing then changes again, and you have to work out, so what does this look like, and actually trying to work that out and trying to continue to communicate within that, and then recognize people's very real grief within that, and how they are dealing with things is quite a challenge.
And I think also, so it's a challenge, ordinarily a challenge, but I think one of the things that we've chatted about before is the whole idea that when you get lost like that in the middle of other losses, so it's almost like you've lined up a whole pile of dominoes and you shove one and they all go down, because actually in the midst of it, it's not just the one immediate loss that you're dealing with, but you're actually dealing with all the other stuff that potentially is unresolved from the last 2 years, of which we know there is much.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're really selling Christmas, I've got to say.
We are, absolutely. It's a cheery Christmas podcast.
It is a cheery Christmas podcast. But it is a reality, I think.
Yeah, and that's the thing, though. It's like we could have Santa's jumping up and down here and all the rest of it, but actually we want to be real about that, and we know for lots of people this actually is difficult, and nobody really wants to talk about it in terms of it being difficult. So I guess, I suppose what we're saying is that if you're listening or watching this, and in actual fact for you Christmas is difficult, and you're not quite sure what you're going to do with it, then we want you to know that you're actually not on your own, that we get it, and there are a whole lot of other people who get it too. It's just perhaps they don't have the courage to talk about it.
Yeah, and I think it's that thing it's that vulnerability thing, isn't it? Of saying, actually, I do find Christmas difficult, and being honest about that, and recognising that probably quite a lot of people around you are feeling the same. Is there anything you're looking forward to about Christmas? Is there one thing that you're thinking, that'll be fun, I'd like to do that?
So I am looking forward to the fact that we are closing for 3 weeks.
We are.
And I have and I can bake. So during the pandemic, I baked a lot, like everybody did. But I had baked before the pandemic, so I wasn't just taking it up. But I had time, and I baked bread during the pandemic. And I couldn't tell you the last time I had time to make a loaf. So I'm actually looking forward to the space that I can do the things that actually bring me joy. That's really that in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And you?
I am planning to go swimming in Loch Lomond on Christmas Eve.
Oh, man.
Quite how long will last, I don't know, but that's our plan. So I'm really looking forward to that, actually. Yes, I am. Excellent. Absolutely in a wetsuit at this point of the year. It is far too cold to not be in a wetsuit. So yeah, full wetsuit, but still, just there's something about just getting out there, and the feel that gives me, and the way that actually really helps my mental health, which I would not quite have thought possible.
And I think perhaps that's a place to land with this then, that, you know, in the midst of the pressures of what needs to be done, and we know, since having looked at the analytics for the podcast, that there's a huge percentage of women that watch this podcast, and it's not that men don't do anything at Christmas, so we're not getting into that debate, but actually we know from talking to lots of women and men that very often women feel a huge pressure at Christmas to get the perfect this and the perfect that and the perfect the next thing. And I suppose where we're landing with this is saying to folks, we hear you, we get it, we understand the pressures and the strains, but actually if there's one thing you can do is to identify that thing that will bring you joy in the midst of it, and carve out time for that. Yeah. And then remember that that's what you've done. Notice how you felt. So being very present in the moment in that, and actually noticing the difference that made to you. Because even if that's only for a really short time, the difference that makes might actually carry you through the rest of the strain and the stress of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's that one thing we often say to people, if their sessions aren't happening, what can you do during the time of your session that when that would normally be taking place, that's just for you? And I think that's a really good practice to do at any point, but particularly over Christmas when routines are upended and things maybe feel a bit difficult. What's that one thing that you can do?
Yeah. And so as far as folks accessing our services here are concerned, we are closing the service on the 16th of December.
We are, yeah.
So we're closing the service on the 16th of December for 3 weeks. But actually, so this podcast will go out a wee bit before that probably, but even before that we're actually going to have closed the waiting list in terms of our counselling service. We've been absolutely deluged by people looking for support, and so rather than create false expectations for folks, we're actually going to just press pause on that. So we're not closing or anything else, we're not stopping, but we'll resume those referrals in the new year.
Yeah, we will. And I suppose I am going to just take this opportunity to say, if you are a person who likes to give to charities at Christmas, I'd really encourage you to think about giving to the small charities, because the big charities find it much easier to survive than the small charities. And actually, as a small charity, we know just how much every single pound that we get donated is used for, and how much we can do with it. So if you're able to do that, please think about small charities, even if it's not our small charity. But the small charities actually are the lifeblood of the third sector, and we need to support them to keep them going.
Yep. And I guess then all that remains for us to do is to wish everybody who is watching or listening to this a very Merry Christmas. Know that an organisation like ours does get it and does understand some of the pressures that are there, some of the stuff that comes up for folk over Christmas time, and know that you're being thought of. In the midst of all of that, keep an eye out on our social media. Feel free to interact with our posts on social media, and let's continue to keep our digital community alive over Christmas time and vibrant over Christmas and New Year, when folks are actually looking for a wee place to connect in and a lifeline sometimes. So we hope you have a lovely Christmas and a very happy New Year. And we are really hoping and praying here actually that the new year is a much better place for everybody than 2022 perhaps has been. Have a lovely time, and we will be back with you again in the new year.